Hi, everybody. My name is Winston Vaughn. I'll be your MC today for today's live stream Series 2020 digital program. I'm the Senior Manager of Renewable Energy here at Series. We are a sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies from around the world on some of the most critical sustainability challenges that we face, from the climate and water crises to the protection of basic human rights throughout the global workforce. I'd like to start today by saying that we remain, of course, very mindful of everybody who continues to be affected directly or indirectly by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And we continue to be especially grateful to those on the front lines who are risking so much and working so hard to ensure that we all stay as healthy and safe as possible in these times. I also want to thank each and every one of you for participating in today's program. As we come towards the end of what is, for many of us, the second month of working from home, we continue to be inspired by the ability of so many of the people that we work with to remain focused on the broad range of important challenges that we still face as our shared long-term objectives. In particular, we have to highlight and say how much we appreciate the generous commitment and support from our speakers and sponsors who have stood by us on this digital journey to reimagine the Series 2020 conference program from an in-person gathering in New York to this digital platform. We clearly would not be here today without your essential support, so thank you. It's, of course, not the same as spending a few days together, but this tremendous participation that we've seen in Series 2020 over the past several weeks has clearly demonstrated to us that the community of passionate and committed people will always find a way to move forward and keep advancing solutions, even under the most trying circumstances. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Before we start today's session, Clean Energy and Supply Chains, I just have a few quick housekeeping notes. Please note that the session is being recorded. We will be providing all participants with a link shortly after completion if you missed anything or want to go back and take some notes. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box that is located in the control panel. We'll do our best to answer as many audience questions as possible at the end of the session. And then please do note that there is a potential that global bandwidth issues may impact today's programming. We may experience some challenges. If we do, that is obviously beyond our control, but if we do, we'll pause the session for 30 seconds to hopefully let the interwebs catch up to us. So thank you ahead of time for your patience if such an issue arises, and we'll knock on wood right now. So now let's talk clean energy. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists who are leading their organization's work with suppliers and customers to increase clean energy and reduce carbon emissions. Should be a great conversation. With us today are Emma Cox, North American Sustainability at McDonald's, Richard Fruhoff, the Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning and Corporate Development at U.S. Steel Corporation, Scott Chu, the Executive Director for the Center of Energy Efficiency and Sustainability at Trane Technologies, and my colleague Dan Seligman, the Senior Manager of Energy Efficiency at Series, who will be the voice of the audience today and asking audience questions. So thanks everybody for joining us. Before I turn this over to our panel, I just want to say a few words to frame up today's conversation and make sure that we're all on the same page. And I'm going to start with the good news here. And the good news is that corporate leadership on climate and clean energy has been incredibly impactful in the last few years. US companies have actually broken renewable energy procurement records, not just last year, but for each of the last 3 years in a row, driving down the price of renewable energy and eliminating barriers. The result of that is that for the first time in history, the US is on track to produce more energy from renewables this year than we are from coal. And it's not just renewable energy that is changing the landscape. Corporate energy efficiency investments are scaling up, driven by technology, data, and electrification technologies. Electric vehicles are coming on strong, driven by lower cost of ownership. And companies are not just doing a lot of good stuff anymore, they're being really smart and strategic about it, aligning their actions with the best available science and working together to make sure that what we're doing is not just good, but it's enough. And it's not just Silicon Valley or consumer brands who are doing this anymore. Industrial companies and sectors that have been traditionally seen as harder to decarbonize are making big, bold commitments and driving the innovation and innovation necessary to find solutions. Now, from a practitioner standpoint, this is incredible. This is dizzying progress, and it is absolutely worth taking a moment to celebrate the progress that we've made. But we also need to recognize that the progress, that from a climate perspective, the progress that we've made is not sufficient to meet the challenges ahead of us. We need to ramp up our ambition and we need to ramp up our pace. Leading companies are starting to do that. They're starting to not only get that, but actually operationalize it. They're realizing that they can and must make an impact well beyond their own operations by using their market power and the power of collaboration. They're actually driving change across their industries, in their home communities, and across supply chains. This approach is gaining steam. As of this morning, 885 global companies have set or committed to set what are known as science-based targets. These are greenhouse gas emissions targets that are based in science and cover not only the company's operations, but their significant emissions in their supply chain and from the use of their products. These indirect emissions, you'll hear many people using this term today, are known as Scope 3 emissions. And these Scope 3 emissions, because they're by definition outside of the company's direct control, are more challenging both to quantify and to take action on. And for many companies, they're actually much larger than their direct emissions, known as Scope 1, or their emissions from their electricity, known as Scope 2. And as a result, these Scope 3 emissions offer much larger opportunities for companies to have an impact and to scale up their activities. So this emerging teamwork approach, collaboration between customers, suppliers, end users, and yes, policymakers as well, is how we can bring corporate clean energy commitments up to the scale needed to meet the challenge ahead and unleash the investments and innovation necessary to change not just our companies, but to change our world for the better. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the people who are actually doing this work, to our esteemed panel here. And we'll start off by talking, I'll start off with one question that I'm hoping everyone can speak to about what has your company done, or what have you planned to do to decarbonize your own operations, and how are you planning to actually share those lessons with your supply chain partners and customers? And Scott, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Winston, and welcome everyone. It's great to have even a virtual webinar. These I've been on several in the past few weeks since we've all worked at home, and many have really helped me to reconsider what happens after we go back. So it's really great that we can be here today. Thanks for the question too about what we're doing. Trane Technologies is a company that makes equipment for commercial buildings in particular, so comfort systems, also for your home, your HVAC system in your yard or whatever's powering your apartment for comfort is probably a Trane system. 1 out of 2 buildings in America is a Trane customer, a Trane project. We also have Thermo King, which is the largest transport refrigeration business in the world, and we bring your fresh strawberries year round through our refrigeration systems that help those strawberries get shipped around the world. Fast forward to what we're doing. We've been concerned with what Winston said for several years, this whole idea of our carbon footprint is much larger than our operational footprint. Our operational footprint is actually 0.25% of our entire carbon footprint. So if you think about that in terms of scale, although we're doing great things around our operational footprint, reducing waste and reducing carbon, it's really the piece that's outside of our direct control that we've been concerned about for several years now. And so we've been working on a previous climate commitment to reduce the carbon footprint of our own facilities and of our products, but recently we announced that we're going way beyond that. We've actually announced something we're calling the Gigaton Challenge. We have committed to reduce our customers' carbon footprint by 1 gigaton of carbon over the next 9 years. And what that essentially means is that our commitment is equal to roughly 2% of the annual emissions, carbon emissions of the world. So it's extremely significant. And it will require to do some of the things that Winston mentioned. We will need to develop a new standard way of calculating the reductions, working with customers, working with suppliers on how you do that. First is sort of setting a baseline, and then going through the scenarios of what does one solution get us in terms of a carbon reduction versus another, and help educate the customers, working with our suppliers on how we do that. So it's a bit of a leading by example, and at the same time committing to something that until this point many companies have been unwilling to do, and we're saying we're ready to do that. We had a science-based target that we completed in 2019. We've now set another one, and this Gigaton Challenge is going to be a 1.5 degree sensitive target. It is significant, but we also don't have great ways to, a standard way to measure all of that. So we'll be working with some of you and other organizations like Ceres to help standardize how this gets done, because I think that's the next area that we all have to pioneer, is how do you measure, track, and report on not only Scope 3, but maybe what I'll use a word I'm not supposed to use, a Scope 4. So it's what happens outside of even your products when you leave them, but it could be what happens over their life cycle once you leave them with a customer. And for us, unlike say maybe a McDonald's, and I know Emma's on the call here, but some of our products we leave with customers for 20 years. And so there's some life cycle impacts that have to be considered and reconsidered, and we're committed to doing that.
Great. Thanks so much, Scott. Rich, do you want to talk about what U.S. Steel is doing in this area?
Sure. Thanks, Winston. Well, we're probably on the flip side of kind of where Scott is. So, I'm at U.S. Steel, founded in 1901. We make steel, about 22 million tons a year globally, 17 million tons in North America. And, we've been on a journey to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions. We announced a goal last fall to reduce them by 20%, our emissions intensity and production of steel over the next 10 years. We make steel through reduction of iron for blast furnaces. It's a carbon intense way to make steel, but we're shifting our footprint. We're using more electric arc furnace technology, which for those who don't know, you can take scrap. Steel is the most recycled material in the world. And from a life cycle perspective, it's great. I mean, you don't lose any of the strength or characteristics of steel every time you recycle it. There's no reduction in the characteristics of the metal. So it's a great story from a recycling perspective. And so there is an alternative way to make steel, which is really to recycle it in a technology called electric arc furnaces, which are different from how integrated steel working makes. You don't have to reduce iron ore from the ground into iron that can be turned into liquid iron and then liquid steel through the blast furnace process. Instead, you take scrap steel, put it into a furnace, and you get giant bolts of electricity to melt the steel. So a lot less emissions intensity directly, but you do obviously want to have green sources of electricity for that. But we announced in the fall a plan to reduce through the change of our footprint to have more electric arc furnace technology in our footprint, a greenhouse gas emissions goal, 20% reduction over the next 10 years. Where we are typically in the supply chain is for all of us who have automobiles, and we've seen the reduction, I think, over the last, while we've been in this COVID situation in greenhouse gas emissions, fewer people are driving. But one of the things we do supply to our customers, the auto industry, is advanced high-strength steel. And that's a product that allows for lightweighting of vehicles to meet federal CAFE standards, improve fuel efficiency, and obviously reduce emissions, and without losing any of the benefits of steel. So you can have aluminum, you can use composites, but really at the end of the day, for the benefits of steel, the carbon intensity and the recyclability of steel, plus just the general protection of having the strength of steel in your vehicle, it's something where we're a leader, and we've been working with all of the major auto manufacturers to get more and more of this advanced high-strength steel into the vehicles that we all drive. So, from the customer side, we've been at this for a while. We get that request to help our customers find ways to lightweight those vehicles we drive, but without losing any of the benefits. And steel, as I said, in the recyclability from a life cycle perspective, it's really a wonderful material. And as we shift in the U.S. to more of the electric arc furnace technology for production of steel, we see less and less emissions from it. Right now, obviously, we have to have green sources of electricity to power those electric arc furnaces, but I think that's coming along very nicely. So, we're working at it, and I think we see a lot of opportunity there, and we're seeing some of the benefits. As I said, this kind of COVID experiment we've been in for the past 2 months, we see kind of what some changes in behavior can do to reduce emissions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rich. And lastly, I'll turn it over to Emma to talk about the work that McDonald's is doing on climate change.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Winston, for the introduction. And yes, as Winston said, I'm Emma Cox. I lead our renewable energy work for McDonald's. And I thought that I would start today by just sort of grounding us in terms of what all of our sustainability work at McDonald's kind of rolls up to, which is our brand promise. And our brand promise for McDonald's is to make delicious, feel-good moments for everyone. And the work that we do in sustainability is really rooted in that feel-good aspect of our brand promise. And so when we started to think about how we could bring that to light, we announced a couple of years ago our Scale for Good framework, which is essentially kind of what we also refer to as our sustainability framework. And within that framework, we focus on 5 key pillar areas, one of which is climate action. And each of the pillar areas we've committed to a public goal, and we have committed within our climate action goal to a science-based target goal. One goal is for restaurants and offices, and that goal is a 36% reduction by 2030 with a 2015 baseline. And then we also have a separate goal for our supply chain, which is a 31% emissions intensity reduction by 2030, also with a 2015 baseline. And so, you know, just to give you an idea of the scale of that goal, our 36% reduction goal is equivalent to reducing the carbon footprint of the entire country of Vietnam. So we believe that that's an ambitious target to reach. And when we sat down and looked at how we were going to achieve that goal, we really realized that renewable energy was going to play a huge role, both in terms of our restaurants and offices, as well as our supply chain. And so that's sort of how my role emerged, as being really focused around renewable energy. And the work that I've been doing over the last few years has been focused on that. You know, our franchisees make up a big part of our organization. As Winston said, you know, we have 40,000 restaurants across the country, across the world, 14,000 across the country, and then 95% of those restaurants are franchised. And so what that means for us in terms of our scope emissions is that our franchisees are considered our scope 3 emissions. So when we set our science-based target goal and we made our commitments around renewable energy, we really had to look at ways in which to reach that goal with such a complex structure. So when we built our renewable energy strategy, you know, we looked at different ways to involve our franchisees, and you know, are continuing to do that. But ultimately, we've decided as a company to start with corporate-backed PPAs while keeping a parallel track on the restaurant-based solutions as legislation becomes more mature around renewable energy solutions for small businesses, because that's really what our franchisees are, small business. But what that means is that the corporation is not just taking responsibility for our scope 1 emissions, but we're also making these investments on behalf of our scope 2 and 3 emissions as well, which is something we haven't seen too much of and we're very proud of. So that's it for me, Winston.
Thanks so much, Emma. And I wanted to circle on back to a couple things that people mentioned in their introductory statements here. Scott, you said something very important that I wanted to bring back up, that as you're looking at your second round of science-based targets, you're working to align those with 1.5 degrees C. Can you speak a little bit to what that means and why you made the decision to do that, and what it means operationally for you looking forward?
Yeah, it's pretty significant. The original, we're one of the few that's actually had one that we've completed, and we're moving on to the second. I remember when we set our first one, that was 6.5, maybe 7 years ago. It was probably 2014. Getting the validation that it was science-based was a simpler process than it is now. We've ways. I think we know a lot more about what it takes to truly be meaningful. But science-based target is really about ensuring that your commitments, that your targets, in the greater context of the environment, that they are significant enough for your sector and for the world that they'll make a difference. That's essentially what it means. There's a lot of scientific definitions, but that's how I like to think about it. And so really it requires, to meet a science-based target threshold, it requires a company to go further than what they've done in the past. It requires more than just incremental improvements, like many companies for years that we were more used to doing. It requires you to go way outside your comfort zone, it requires you to think more long-term. So, you know, it's going to take 10 years, I think, for many to hit an impact that's going to be big enough to make a big difference globally. And so when you think about carbon and science-based targets, it also needs to align with the Paris Accord intention, which is that it's all got to come down so that we can meet what's needed for the Earth very quickly. So this idea of acceleration of reductions. And for a company like ours that has a large carbon footprint because of the indirect energy use of our products, or I should say the energy use of our products create an indirect greenhouse gas footprint for us. That requires us to do a lot of things differently. We're thinking about new product introductions and innovations that would lessen the use of energy in our product portfolio. It also requires us to think differently about how our customers' behaviors are with our products. So we're using a whole host of solutions to help our products have a smaller footprint once we leave them inside a commercial building, for instance, or maybe using digital and automation for our Thermo King business and transport refrigeration to help customers make better decisions and in managing the fresh food as it's being transported. So we've got to couple the old way of doing things like making energy efficient products. And on top of that, you're going to have to add layers of intelligence so that we actually get the reductions down where they need to be. So we've submitted our information for the science-based target piece, and like I mentioned earlier, it's going to be complicated getting there, and it's going to require us to work entirely across the value stream. We will touch every supplier, and we have many thousands, tens of thousands of suppliers. It's going to require us to think very differently about our own operations and how we manufacture products, and in particular, it's going to impact how we work with our customers going forward to make the science-based target happen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Scott. And actually, one thing, Rich, that you mentioned that I'm hoping we can delve into a little bit more is you mentioned the kind of gigantic lightning bolts, I believe was the term that you used, of energy that it takes to turn on an electric arc furnace. I'd imagine that creates additional challenges as far as procuring renewable energy in specific localities, because that's a lot more electricity than, say, turning on an air conditioner or powering up an office. Can you speak to some of the challenges involved that you've encountered as you work to electrify, really heavy industry processes like that?
Yeah, so we're just starting off with electric arc furnace technology, Winston, right now. So at our Fairfield, Alabama plant, we will be commissioning our first electric arc furnace later this year. But you're absolutely right. The base load of electricity you need to power electric arc furnaces is tremendous. In the U.S. and North America, roughly 2/3 of steel making is actually by electric arc furnace technology. The remaining 1/3 is through the traditional integrated steel making process. Interestingly, it's the reverse in Europe, which I find very interesting. I mean, because I think in large part it's because of the electricity costs in Europe. You haven't seen that sort of market-based drive to electric arc furnace technology over there. But even before we commission that first electric arc furnace in Alabama, we've been working with electricity providers here in the Pittsburgh area, where we have our Mon Valley Works that remains an integrated steelmaking complex right now. We procure emission-free energy certificates, so that any of the outside electricity that we currently need to procure, we're comfortable with the sourcing of it. We are typically one of the largest consumers of electricity, even without electric arc furnace technology. But you're absolutely right. Trying to find the amounts of electricity that you need to operate these EAFs and get it from a renewable source is a challenge. It absolutely is, and it's one that we're going to have to keep working on in the U.S. and even more so in Europe, where we have an operation. We have an operation, I should have mentioned at the outset, in Slovakia. And as I said, we've looked at EAFs, and the general approach in Europe is kind of the flip side of here in North America, much more still in the blast furnace heavy carbon route to make steel than we have here in North America.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing those gigantic green lightning bolts. That should be really exciting. Yeah. And turning to Emma, McDonald's restaurants are just about everywhere around the world, and in the United States, they're in big cities, small communities, rural, urban. You really have a very deep reach into communities in the U.S. What challenges have you encountered in the U.S. and or abroad, if you want to speak to that, in accessing renewable energy for what are, as you mentioned, largely small businesses? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Winston. That's a great question. And, you know, I like this question because it really gives me an opportunity to talk about where the concept of scale for good came from. And so, you know, historically, McDonald's has kind of viewed our scale as being an obstacle to getting things done. So if you think about it, you know, large system, large company, it's really tough to kind of push these initiatives, especially when you have a franchised organization. You're trying to push these initiatives down, bring your franchisees along with you. You know, so historically, we've really viewed that as being a challenge for us, and it is realistically a challenge when we try to implement things across a large system, right? But we wanted to shift that paradigm with our concept of scale for good, and that you know, kind of viewing our scale as a way to do better and good in our communities and for the world and for our customers. And so really kind of using that narrative differently. So yes, while our scale is a challenge in terms of having restaurants everywhere, as you say, we're very dispersed. We have a dispersed portfolio, and unlike a Facebook that has kind of, you know, very concentrated load in specific geographic regions, you know, we've had to design our carbon reduction and renewable energy strategy around you know, diversifying our portfolio and kind of really putting projects everywhere, which gives us a lot of options, right? And so it's an exciting opportunity to have. Another thing that I'm really excited about is around kind of what we're looking to do next. You know, last year we announced 2 large-scale VPPAs. What we're looking to do next is kind of add another layer onto this scale for good concept, which is what we're calling kind of internally, this is not a formal announcement of what we're doing, but internally we're referring to this plan as kind of renewable energy 2.0. So what can we do next with our scale? And so, you know, now that we're doing these VPPAs and a lot of other corporates are doing VPPAs, you know, what's the next level of good? And, you know, can McDonald's influence the communities that these renewable energy projects are in? Can we find ways to use our scale to help these communities in the way they want to be helped? You know, our restaurants are in communities. We're a community-based organization. Another thing that we're looking into is policy work. How can we, you know, use our scale as McDonald's, a large brand that's very visible, to, you know, to bring policy along? How can we ask for what's helpful in terms of bringing renewable energy to smaller communities, to smaller businesses, making renewable energy more affordable? So not just furthering our own goals, but using kind of our scale to further, you know, good for the rest of the world. So that's hopefully that addresses your question.
Yeah,
shifted it more from obstacles to opportunity.
And I think that's a really important point, right? Like when you look at the amazing work that the U.S. Steels and Trains are doing of the world, it's easy when you have that kind of scale to go out there and do big, huge renewable energy deals. But if you are a mom and pop shop on Main Street that's reopening its businesses next month and wanting to shift to clean energy, you don't have a desk of energy traders that can do complex transactions. You don't have the scale for purchase. So what can we do both through policy changes, as you mentioned, and through supply chain engagement to help break down those barriers and make sure that these small businesses and individual customers, homeowners can take advantage of renewable energy in the same way that Google or Facebook can. I think that's a really important focus. And I wanted to just kind of flip around. Actually, I wanted to just take a second. We threw around the term VPPA, so I want to just explain that quickly. I won't get into the details for our audience here, but VPPA is a virtual power purchase agreement, and it's a mechanism that companies are using to basically do big, huge utility scale renewable energy deals that then create enough renewable energy to offset the electricity usage for local facilities. And that's really key for companies like McDonald's and Starbucks and others that have distributed load where they couldn't necessarily do a tiny little wind farm for each facility that they have across the country. So I won't get into depth on that, but that's what a VPPA is. Rich, I wanted to turn around because you guys kind of sit in a very different place in the supply chain. You're at the top of a lot of companies' supply chains, and I'm sure a lot of our audience's supply chains. So what are you hearing from customers as more and more companies are setting supply chain targets? what are those conversations like, and how are you engaging with key customers around these ideas?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we really are in a little bit different position than Trane or McDonald's in the supply chain. You know, as I said at the beginning, you know, we do hear from our customers. Some of our customers are, you know, they're the big names you would expect in the auto industry, in the appliance industry, and they all have, you know, their own targets, which they flow down through their supply chain. So we're typically on the receiving end of that. And you know, the conversations are ones where, you know, we talk about what can we do to help them achieve their targets, both for their, you know, from their supply chain, but for them in their product production processes as well. So as I mentioned at the outset, you know, we make advanced high strength steels. Our XG3 steel is, you know, used in increasing numbers of platforms and SUVs and smaller vehicles. Our facilities in Europe make electrical steel, so they'll be involved in, you know, as we move toward e-mobility and electric vehicles, we work with customers there who are looking for the electrical steels needed for those vehicles and for the batteries, but also, you know, looking for us to produce it in a more carbon efficient manner. And of course, in Europe, it's a little bit different because they've got cap and trade, which we don't have here. So you already have kind of a regulatory perspective that you have to address in Europe. In North America and the US, you know, it tends to be more of a discussion of, hey, we really want the XG3 or the advanced high strength steel, but we also want to see how you're producing and how your sustainability program in general, your energy efficiency, show us your metrics, your targets, how are you improving your carbon intensity, which is, you know, one reason we set the goal we did last fall. And as I said, we, you know, in those discussions, it's always helpful to say we're shifting our portfolio balance, you know, toward more of the electric arc furnace technology, which is less carbon intensive. And I didn't mention at the outset, you know, part of our strategy as well, I mentioned the electric arc furnace in Fairfield. Last fall, we announced we've acquired a 49.9% interest in a steel company called Big River Steel in Arkansas, which operates solely EAF furnaces. And interestingly, it's the world's first LEED certified steel mill. And I often get the question, you know, what did you have to go through? We didn't do it. We bought it after they went through it. But how do you get LEED certified as a steel mill? I think they had to invent a new process for that. But it's a discussion with our customers about, you know, how are you as a company producing the products we need for vehicles, for appliances, and trying to get that carbon intensity down, our energy efficiency up. And in the steel industry, you know, cost is incredibly important. So we're always looking for ways to reduce our electrical spend, recycle as much as possible. It's almost inherent in the steel industry.
Yeah. I'm hoping you can actually, you raised something that I think is really fascinating there that I'm hoping you can dig a little bit deeper on. You know, the difference between operating in Europe, where a lot of this is driven by regulatory frameworks, cap and trade and the like, versus in the US, where, you know, there's a ton of companies that have set science-based targets that have committed to going 100% renewable, but these are all informal, voluntary decisions, and there's not a legislative process to advance this. I'm curious if you can speak to the difference about both of those worlds, and what do you think that means for the future of both regulation and collaboration?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think in Europe, you know, some folks may be familiar with the hybrid program, which is an effort to look at an alternative way to make steel through the integrated process. And so that's a collaboration in Sweden to use hydrogen for steel making. You know, when you make steel through the integrated route, which is you have to reduce iron ore, there's really only 3 ways to do that. Not that I know this, but I've talked to enough metallurgists and they've taught me. You either use carbon, you use electrolysis, or you use hydrogen. And hydrogen has been announced in Europe, for example, Winston, as you mentioned, you know, because they have these cap and trade targets, they have a high cost of electricity. They are pursuing in Europe hydrogen-based integrated steel making, but it's so expensive to generate the volumes of hydrogen needed to make steel through that route. They have public-private partnerships, right? So they have partnerships between utilities, between steel makers. The EU is funding things. I think that's what we need in North America when you think about, trying to achieve some of these goals. We need more of that kind of participation because, trying to fund hydrogen, low-cost hydrogen for any single company, the volumes needed, it's a mammoth task.
Yeah, so there's a lot we can do, but when it comes to transforming entire industries, having a coordinated plan might be impactful. I think is what I hear you saying there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I do want to get to audience questions, but before we do that, I think it's important, as we did from the start here, to just recognize that we're in fairly unprecedented times here. And as the world slowly begins over the next couple of weeks to emerge from social distancing, we find ourselves facing a changed world, and in the US and around the world, an unprecedented economic recession. So I guess my question is, what company, and we'll need to rebuild a lot of what we've built over the last decade. My question is, what companies can do to ensure that as we build back, we're building for the future rather than just building back what we had in the past. What do we need governments to do to support the work of companies like yours to make sure that the world that we're building is ready for the climate changes and other changes ahead of us? And I'll just throw that out there. You guys can all dive in. It's an easy one, I know.
One comment, Winston, would be just we have to have a systems approach to things. I think there will be we're learning some lessons about interdependence here through this pandemic. It's teaching us about how we may have all thought we were, these isolated, we had it all together, and I think we now understand this concept of interdependency like never before. And that's number one. And so going forward, we're going to have to accomplish what needs to be accomplished, working together as a system, whether that's McDonald's, US Steel, and Train together in the supply chains we represent. We won't get there without a systems level approach, including our own commitments and actions. And so I think this pandemic certainly has underscored that for us.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I think for McDonald's, I'm going to keep this very simple, but I've been very encouraged to see that our leadership is still fully committed to reaching our science-based target. And I believe that, coming out of this crisis, we really need to double down on climate resilience. And if you think about it from a McDonald's perspective, not just McDonald's, this affects the entire world. Without, climate resilience, there is no food. We have to make sure that we keep this narrative going, and our goals remain kind of at the top of our business imperative. So I just reinforce the fact that climate resilience will need to stay a part of the conversation moving forward.
Yeah, I think one thing I would add, Winston, that I think is encouraging is the recognition that, unfortunately, because of what we've seen coming out of COVID-19, but the recognition that there's a benefit to having a regional supply chain. You reduce transport emissions, transport costs by regionalizing your supply chain. So I think we're going to see some more diversification of supply chains coming out of the response. We've already seen that a little bit, and I think they'll have some, maybe incidental benefits as well from a climate change perspective.
Absolutely, thank you. So I want to bring in my colleague Dan Seligman as the voice of the audience here. I know we've had a lot of folks chiming in here. What does the audience have to say? What questions does the audience have for our panel here?
So I'll start with the last question, and that's come across the wires here. For each of you, what are the biggest challenges you see in your supply chain to emissions reductions?
Can I go first, Dan?
Sure.
Yeah, so one of our great learnings was, so we started working with our supply chain about a year ago now. It was late last spring. We have a new commitment where our suppliers are going to share our operational commitments, one of which is carbon neutral, one of which is net positive water, and the other is net waste to landfill, so no waste to landfill. To get our top suppliers to commit to those things, we had to first understand where they were. And what we learned of many of our top suppliers, many had never set a target before. So they didn't have the baseline information. They didn't have a system to track their energy use, for instance. And so we work with many of our suppliers on how do you go about setting a target? How do you go about tracking progress against the target? And really sharing our own company's expertise and history with our suppliers to help them understand the whole process, sort of the governance around tracking and setting firm targets. And so that was a big learning for us, for sure, was this whole shared learning that needed to happen and collaboration around sharing and tracking targets.
It's very helpful. So it's the know-how that is sometimes missing. Rich or Emma, do you want to tackle that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, as we said at the outset, for us, we're a little bit different in the supply chain hierarchy. And in fact, we're actually, we actually, in our steel making in the integrated side, get most of the iron ore we need from our own mines that we own. So in some sense, it's easier in that we can kind of control what needs to be controlled. We don't have to flow it down to as many suppliers. But on the other hand, it is a challenge in terms of the integrated steel making, which is carbon intensive. There's no doubt about it. But that's, goes back to our switch to this kind of best of both strategy where we're diversifying our footprint to get more of that electric arc furnace technology into it.
Right.
Yeah, and thanks, Dan. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think for us, it's data. Kind of a boring answer, but data has been tough for us. One of the biggest challenges. You think about our supply chain. It's we kind of have certain layers that we can see and certain layers that we can't. Within our franchisees, as I mentioned, we only have visibility over about 5% of that data, and then from there we have to kind of make extrapolations. So I would say just kind of the data and the work that we've done in extrapolations is actually pretty amazing. So we've been able to make good progress there, but that was one of our biggest challenges.
So when Winston and I have talked to companies, we about supply chain emissions, we often hear about challenges and the difficulty of doing it. But one of the things we've been pleasantly surprised to hear is that companies often, once they walk down the road of addressing supply chain emissions, find new opportunities, whether it's cost reduction or actually new business opportunities. And wonder if any of you have discovered any of the same things in approaching supplier emissions. Not so much. Yeah, Scott, do you want to take a swipe at that, or?
Yeah, I mean, we've encountered it, but it's still early in the game. I mean, it's a mixed bag too, based on a whole host of things, based on size of supplier, based on their own history, where they're located, and we with a very diverse supply chain like many of us have. I guess you get what you expect, which is sort of a mixed bag, and so that's where we are. And the way we've been targeting to work with our suppliers has been choosing spend. So we're working with roughly 80% of our spend, which is about 500 suppliers roughly. We had to just narrow the ocean down to a group that we could actually work with, and it's still a mixed bag there. So I think that's part of the mountain of work that still has to happen.
Right. So let's see, I'm just take a look at the questions.
Quick question, actually.
Go ahead, Vincent.
You mentioned how many suppliers that you have and having to narrow it down. How do you make those decisions in terms of who to prioritize to engage with?
Yeah, so of the 80, so we went with spend. So we're working with 80% of our spend, and so that's roughly 500. There are thousands and thousands beyond that represent the other 20% of our spends, but we work with that 80%, those that represent 80% of our spend. So 500, and then of that group, we created a sort of a sustainability supplier council, and that's the group that serves as a sounding board for us when we say we think we should do this, and what's the impact on you and other suppliers, and we let that that group of suppliers be a sounding board to us, and they represent small, medium, and large suppliers of diverse geographies. So they can give us sort of immediate feedback on our thinking, and we can tweak our plans, including our timing, based on their feedback.
I wonder if Emma could speak to that question as well, whether the individual store owners are, the franchisees are receptive to sustainability efforts. How do they respond to the company's efforts in this area?
Yeah, it's the story of my life. I think it's really tough because you think about kind of how much is coming at the franchisees from the corporate level. They really have to kind of sift through the various asks that are coming from corporate. And so what it comes down to is just the criteria that any business considers. I mean, these are small business owners, and so they need to consider a sustainability initiative just like they would consider any other initiative that affects their business. And so does this make sense for my business? Does this have long-term benefits for my business? So it's really up to us, the sustainability team, to build the business case for them, to kind of make this an attractive opportunity for them. And in the case of renewable energy, for me, it was a very attractive opportunity for them because ultimately it didn't affect them. It did not introduce any sort of additional cost to their restaurants. They didn't have to take on any additional risk. The company was doing that for them, and it didn't add any additional complexity to their restaurants as well. So, I think we did a pretty good job in terms of building the business case there, but I think, many of the organizations on this call can relate to that. It's really about, you're selling an initiative essentially. And so, but in general, our franchisees are very receptive to the work, and they're proud to tell the story. So, they're always asking us, how can we, talk about this in our restaurants to our customers? So we're working on how we can do that better.
Good, helpful. So Rich alluded to the hybrid renewable hydrogen project in Europe. I wonder if Emma and Scott could also speak to the question of next generation solutions that you see in your respective industries. What's coming over the horizon that, especially on supply chain emissions, that's going to really change the game here?
Well, actually, Winston mentioned one, Dan, and that was this whole issue of VPPAs. And we're working on an approach right now where we would share a VPPA with our suppliers. So we already have VPPAs that cover roughly a third of our electricity use in the US. And we're thinking about potentially another one right now in 2020. And to do that one, we're approaching our suppliers to say, look, here's how this works. It's not typical that a small, medium-sized company would do a VPPA, but you can have a slice of this one. If we'll go out and we'll help do the large contractual and sort of legal obligations of the contract for VPPA, as long as we have several of our suppliers agree to take smaller pieces of the VPPA, and then together, it's obviously a much bigger deal, much bigger contract, much bigger VPPA. So you get the scale and aggregate that would be meaningful, and also would help some of those smaller companies participate in something that until now is not possible.
And Emma, I know you mentioned doing similar work within your supply chain. I know that you mentioned you're in the early stages of the 2.0 of your plan, but I'm wondering how you guys are looking at that approach in terms of working with your suppliers on renewable energy deals.
Yeah, like you said, Winston, we are very early on, and I would echo what Scott said in that, we're looking into aggregation with our suppliers and really kind of, again, playing on that theme of using our scale for good. We can do that even more so in partnership with our suppliers. And so we, realize that, and our suppliers are eager to get going. But again, with any kind of process, it's a change management process. It takes organizations a little while to kind of socialize the concept of this type of investment with their leadership. And so we're having to kind of, again, since we've been through this, we're using kind of our lessons learned and best practices to socialize those with our suppliers through webinars. And so that's been very helpful in terms of bringing them on board. But I'll also just jump on to what Scott said around kind of renewable energy solutions that are out there and in terms of what's up and coming. So we've been really excited to be in this space because it is so new and so kind of moldable at this point in time. And so we've been excited to kind of dig into the various opportunities that there are to weigh in terms of how to shape the solutions that are needed out there. So as an example, community solar is one that we've looked into in the past. Community solar, just for the folks on the line, are community solar projects that can be divvied up amongst small businesses, amongst residential, and it's typically kind of sized proportionately for the community. And so McDonald's has looked into community solar as one of those solutions that our franchisees can participate in. And frankly, it's a great program and concept. It's a great way to connect to the community for franchisees to buy renewable energy, but ultimately it's just not there legislatively in terms of scalability. So, it's really not one of those programs that is available for everyone yet. So we're working with our kind of local groups and legislation partners to advance policy around community solar in particular. But that's just one example there of how we can kind of weigh in and start to shape these solutions that are out there.
Absolutely. And I think that community solar is a really interesting piece because you can, as a large off-taker, be the anchor tenant for that facility. You're buying up 60% of the project, and then the rest can be distributed to individuals or to even at the household level. And of course, there's only a handful of states where that type of structure is possible, but is really impactful in those places. And I will say to get to Scott's point, I think this is a great way. This stuff is free, right? You already have the expertise. You already have the market cloud, and by collaborating with other players, you can really leverage that to help people who can't access renewable energy do it. I think a great example is a deal that happened last year, maybe a year and a half now, with Apple and Akamai, which are big, huge data companies, but they brought in at the last minute Swiss Re and Etsy to be off-takers for smaller portions of those projects. And that resulted in what is, I think, to date, still the smallest corporate PPA of all time, which is Etsy signing a 4 megawatt renewable energy deal, which is enough to get them to 100% renewable. They have a couple offices right down the big footprint. But that kind of collaboration it doesn't cost anything. It can really open up doors for your supply chain partners. Dan, do you have any
questions? Last question.
Yeah.
Last question. One more.
Yeah.
Maybe this is most appropriate for Scott, but I wonder if you see any particular energy efficiency solutions that are gaining traction with your suppliers, or maybe Emma could also speak to that question.
Energy efficiency solutions. Well, like I mentioned, with the suppliers, so they're all at different levels. It's very diverse. Larger suppliers already have many times sophisticated programs to reduce their own operational efficiencies, reduce our energy use, and then it's scattered from there to those who've never even attempted to put in place a program that would increase the efficiency of their facilities. And so we see it's everywhere. So yeah, we see lots of great things from suppliers that want to join us with a VPPA, which is sort of sophisticated approach, to those who want to find out how to change out their lighting to reduce their own energy load. So it's very diverse. All of them are good things though, and I think it's a win for all of us. The more we can do this, I'm just as happy, I think, for those suppliers who've never thought about changing out their lighting to reduce their energy load as I am for those who are doing a VPPA, because I think it all points to this, what Emma was saying around this aggregate reductions are going to be monumental. And the more we do that, the more we do what Winston said in the beginning, the more we continue to push for a greener grid. This is what leads to a greener grid, in my opinion, and it transforms things over time. I think I'm excited right now about what's happened with the grid over the past 5 years, I don't think the pandemic's going to slow that down. I think the next 5 will be just as monumental.
Yeah, it turns out having a zero fuel cost makes you pretty competitive in a market.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. Emma, I don't know if you want to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, you know, Dan, I don't have much to add from what Scott said because I would pretty much mirror his answer, other than the fact that, you know, my world is really centered around renewable energy. And I know that's just part of the solution, but we found that, you know, when we were assessing solutions for our system for renewable energy, you know, on-site solar was one of those solutions that really just didn't work for our restaurants for a number of reasons that I won't get into, but they do work for a lot of our suppliers. So we've been pretty active in terms of engaging suppliers, distribution centers that we feel are prime candidates for on-site renewable energy. So that's it for me.
Well, thank you all, and I'll give it back to Winston for the last 2 minutes.
Thanks so much, Dan, and thanks so much for the audience. And I have to say the worst part about doing these things virtually is I can't have the audience applaud our amazing panel. So I'll do it for them. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be a part of this. This was a fantastic conversation, and I really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else did as well. So I want to thank everyone for taking part in today's session. Before we do wrap up for the day, I just wanted to take special note, and thanks to, as you can see down below us here, all the sponsors you see on the screen who provided instrumental support for our digital series 2020. Please note that you will again receive a follow-up email with a recording of the session shortly if you want to go back and review any of your notes or share with colleagues. For those who are part of the series 2020, another session on building back better, which we talked about a little bit in today's session. This building back better opportunities for jobs and economic recovery in clean technologies and sustainable infrastructure. That's a great session coming up with Richard L. Trumka, the president of AFL-CIO, Torben Morger Petersen, the CEO of Pension Denmark, and our own Kirsten Spalding, the Senior Department Director of our Series Investor Network. So to register, if you're not yet, or to learn more about our upcoming sessions, you can go to www.series2020.org. Again, series2020.org. So thank you so much for all of your time, and the session is adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.